Welcome everybody to a new episode of the Blue Dragon podcast, and today I have the honor of talking to Josh Garverick. He is one of the co-authors of a great book, Azure Integration Guide for Business. He's also an MVP. He lives in New York in the Buffalo region, and he specializes in Azure as a cloud architect and also in DevOps and securely writing code. Take a listen to this wonderful episode. Enjoy. So welcome everybody to this new episode of the Blue Dragon podcast, and today I have the honor of introducing you to Joshua Garverink. He is one of the co-authors of the Azure Integration Guide for Business, published by Pact. Josh, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Now, before we dive into the topic of Azure and the integration side, can you share with us, how did you end up writing a book like this for Pact?
It was an interesting proposition. So I'd written a couple of other things for them, done some other coursework online as well, and they had reached out to me with an opportunity to help co-author this book because they're looking for folks for specific content areas. And I got integrated pretty quickly off the jump with that, and the rest is history, as they say. I worked through the content that I needed to and helped rewrite and revise those chapters. And I think the overall product is something that's hopefully really useful for folks, because that was the intent behind writing it.
Nice. Can you share a bit about your background? How did you start in the industry, and how did you end up using Azure and all of that?
Sure. So computer science was not my main major in college. I ended up going into human resources, stayed in that industry for 8 years. But during that time, I was learning how to use HR systems and data warehouses, taught myself how to not only build machines, but also how to program, use databases, data structures and things like that. And from that point, I went over into full-time development. So after about 8 years in the field. So I started off in programming, software development, and did everything from, .NET, which was, fairly fresh at the time, all the way to COBOL, JCL, and SAS mainframe programming, because one of the unfortunate side effects of being employed where I was that a lot of their systems were mainframe based, and necessity is the mother of learning, or something like that. Throughout, several years after that, went through different software engineering roles, worked my way up to software architecture, started getting really heavily introduced to DevOps, and not just from a procedural standpoint or a cultural standpoint, but also the tooling behind it. And it was around that time that I had reached out and started asking questions around some of the training that was out there. So if you remember Microsoft Learning Academy back in the day, I'd actually taken a couple courses with Steve Borg and Anthony Borton. They had done some stuff around TFS and things like that. And I'll never forget this. I emailed Steve because I just wanted to say thanks for creating really great content, and that I really appreciated it, and that I really learned a lot. And I didn't expect him to email me back at all. Not at all. And within 2 hours, he responded to me, and he said, "Oh, great. I'm really glad you enjoyed everything and all this stuff." And started going back and forth. And it turns out he was a part of a group called the ALM Rangers, which was a co-sponsored group by the Microsoft folks, with a PM on the Microsoft side. So Microsoft full-time employees plus non-Microsoft full-time employees. And you got to work on a lot of gap fillers for the community. And there was a whole NDA process, because we were working on stuff that obviously was not ready for public consumption yet. During that time, I worked on the alpha for the build system, so Azure Pipelines. I worked on the early alpha for that with a bunch of other folks from the Microsoft side, which was really, really cool. And from there, I got nominated, got into the MVP program, was using Azure shortly thereafter for work, but also going through and learning as much as I could, getting certified where I could, and making it a point to really find out as much as I could about the different services and the different ways in which you can do things in the cloud. And that's kind of where we end up today.
Nice. So you literally help build the infrastructure of Azure.
Yeah, it's kind of wild, isn't it?
So somewhere on Azure, your code is somewhere in the core.
Well, I don't know if it's my code so much as it was, we worked on the actual nuts and bolts of testing out pipelines and making sure that it would run on a bunch of different operating systems. So, for example, I had a Mac Mini, a Raspberry Pi, PC, and a laptop that I all had wired up with agents to test out different builds. So I was doing multi-OS builds directly from one definition, and that was kind of one of the use cases we had to work with. So
Nice.
if you're happy about building on Raspberry Pi or Mac OS, you're welcome.
That's
I
great to hear.
had some help with that. But
Nice. And today you're actually working for Xebia. Can you
correct.
share a bit more? Because here in Belgium and the Netherlands, we also have a pretty large footprint of the company. Share a bit more about that, please.
Yeah, of course. So Xebia obviously is a worldwide company with many different service lines. I myself have been in the Microsoft services area, and that's also very well represented in Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany as well. So on the U.S. side, we've got a group of folks, high-end consulting, working with everything from SMB to enterprise customers, and that's in the space of DevOps, in the space of things like Copilot adoption with GitHub Copilot, GitHub migrations, application modernizations, so taking apps that are VM bound and helping to break them apart a bit, or even just starting greenfield and helping folks understand what different services exist out there, what they're for, and how best to use them in the course of their application. I've been a cloud solution architect there for about 2 years. Prior to that, I was a CSA at another company as well, so I've got about 7 years in with that particular discipline.
Great, wonderful. So my plan is actually to go through the chapters of your book, the one that you co-authored, just to get some insights on each chapter, but from the perspective for IT leaders, CIOs, CTOs, etc. So I think the first chapter starts with unlocking new opportunities with Azure. So imagine you're a CIO, CTO, you have a lot of stuff on-premise. Why should somebody like that move to Azure?
My opinion is that moving to Azure does a couple of things for you from a flexibility and innovation standpoint. I've worked in data center led VMs and other services for a long time. I know it can take a while to spin resources up. It can also take a while to get them approved. You tend to treat them more like they're your pets, right? I know VM01 really well. I'm on there every day, and I would be really, really unhappy if I couldn't access VM01 anymore. With Azure, you obviously get the ability to not only spin up infrastructure for your needs at a specific time, but also decommission that stuff too, so that you have the ability to manage that lifecycle in a different way. It also gives you the ability to give your teams autonomy to be able to try different things out, try different solutions out. Some of the best things that I've seen from teams is where they're enabled to go out there and not only spin up VMs, but also use things like app services, function apps, logic apps, service bus, and things like that to help solve problems in different ways. And in the process, end up learning a lot and also coming up with some really great solutions that can ultimately help drive performance at the app level, but also scalability and reliability from the back end, from the operational side.
Great, got it. Now, what I typically find is that people managing their local data center on premise, they're typically IT operations folks, IT systems administrators, etc. So then you move to the cloud, but now all of a sudden it kind of shifts more towards PaaS services, and so it's more like a developer focused. And what I see, at least in my experience, is that many IT ops people try to keep it on the IaaS level because that's what they know and they understand, the virtual machine, etc. So what recommendation or advice can you give to an organization that's kind of stuck on the IaaS level and you want to move them to the PaaS level?
I would say approach that with a twofold approach. One is don't be afraid of what's out there. Like, don't be afraid of PaaS. Don't be afraid of SaaS for that matter. There are a lot of really great tools out there, a lot of really great services out there, and leveraging those shouldn't be detrimental to your career. The other thing is a lot of folks, and I've worked with IT operations teams on this, a lot of folks in those roles feel like they're going to become irrelevant, right? They don't have the locus of control. They don't have the ability to know their whole domain. My argument to that is all of the skills that you've acquired during your tenure as an IT operations professional is still useful when you're going to the cloud. And that's not only from the perspective of IaaS, but also from looking at different PaaS services. So what are the targeted uses for these things? What are the uptime requirements for these things? What's your capacity planning look like? You still have to do all of that stuff to ensure that the components of your application are going to run smoothly. So for me, it's less about looking at it like, oh, I'm a dinosaur, I'm going to get let out to pasture, but more from the perspective of I have these skills and now I can hone them in a new way and become even more of an asset to the company than I was before.
Great. So basically, those skills still apply in the cloud world. It may be a bit different, but the principles remain as in monitoring, scaling, capacity management. Great. So that's good to hear. What I typically find is also moving to cloud is a culture shift or a mindset shift, and the resistance typically comes from the people itself in their mindset. Any tips or best practices for an IT leader to create some kind of environment that helps them make that shift?
It comes from the top. First of all, I've talked with folks who have had very heavy buy-in from executive leadership and top leadership, and I've had some that have had executive leadership basically just tell them, you need to move to the cloud. And there's no real reason or strategy behind it. It's just, well, everyone else is moving to the cloud. We need to move to the cloud. Take it one step at a time. Look at it holistically from your leadership structure and from the cultural perspective, and understand what those points are before you start to disseminate that message, right? If there's a lot of resistance around like that IT operations side of things, so you would pivot and look at, how do we allow folks to still use the same skills and develop new skills and still be relevant in this world. If it's from the developer standpoint of, I only want to write code and I don't want to know anything about infrastructure, there are ways of doing things like platform engineering, for example, that's meant to drive more of a self-service type of delivery model for cloud services, VMs, and everything else. So it's really plan out what it is that you want and what you want folks to get out of it and help them get excited about it. Now, in addition, I would also say find some folks internally who are trusted within the community, so within your own organization, who people tend to listen to, and tap them to help you spread the word. Use that network of evangelism to help you get people excited about going out there and building things in the cloud and experimentation and feeling good about the fact that you can go out there and do this stuff, tear it down, and you're encouraged to do that. You're encouraged to fail fast as well, and find things that do work and don't work and move them along the pipeline. So
nice. So from the top, give that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Because typically moving to the cloud, developers love it because they can start coding and start deploying immediately. IT ops typically loves their servers that they can touch and they see the lights blinking and now it's gone, it's in the cloud, so they're kind of afraid for that. But great point. Good. What about moving towards cloud also means having a new architecture, cloud architecture. What are some important lessons learned for IT leaders when they're moving their applications to the cloud regarding re-architecting, etc.?
One of my favorites is the cloud is more secure if you make it more secure, right? Meaning you can deploy all kinds of different components, but if you don't follow a standard set of guardrails or a standard governance pattern or anything like that, you can absolutely leave things completely wide open. I remember a few years ago I was working for a client who had another team of folks that was managing a specific subset of applications, and they were running them on the time. It was Azure Container Services, if you remember the precursor to Azure Kubernetes Service. And they left port 22 open, which obviously is not a good thing to leave any major standard ports open like that. And yeah, they ended up having Bitcoin miners on their Azure Container Service clusters that were trying to run business critical applications. So it's equal parts understanding what you're working with and having a good governance and security baseline around that to make sure that when people are able to self-serve or go out and deploy stuff, that they're doing so in an environment that has already been kind of curated to help make things more secure. That's probably one of my favorites.
Exactly. What I also like about organizations moving to the cloud is they now have access to a whole new paradigm of architectures. Because typically on premise they are like it's either monolith or perhaps they already have some Kubernetes running locally, but in the cloud it's all standardized. You can move to Kubernetes or containers easily. You can move to functions easily because it's already available, right? Can you give or what type of advice would you give a CTO who now has access to a whole catalog of Azure services, changing architecture? Like, how would you guide him through making choices?
I like the model that the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF, uses for things like incubation, kind of standardized things, and then graduated, so things that are mature enough to operate on their own. I like to use that as kind of a paradigm of what to do. So while it's very important to have a good set of solid, even graduated architectural patterns for solving specific business problems, for hosting specific workloads, focus on getting that base first, right? And really get good at it. So whether that is VMs, whether that's app services, a lot of folks start with app services because a lot of things are Internet Information Services based. If you look at some of the more legacy apps, like your .NET MVC, like 3.4, that type of era of application that's very IIS based, and app services tends to be a decent parallel between the on-prem and the cloud world. Find those spots where folks are going to have familiar ground and let them get good at that. Now bring up areas of incubation, things that you want to start experimenting with. And it's equally important to look at it from what technologically does it do and what does it give me from a business value perspective. Great. Kubernetes is a great example of this because, and this is kind of a hot take, but I would say a large portion of people who pick Kubernetes as their means of orchestration don't really need Kubernetes, right? They want to use containers, which is fine, but there are often better ways of implementing that, and Kubernetes is a lot to manage. Trust me, I'm a certified Kubernetes administrator. So yeah, there's a lot to it, and it can be overwhelming.
I think that's also the beauty of the cloud, that for certain technologies you have, let's say, levels of complexity. Like I want to manage everything myself, I go for AKS. I know I would just want to use a container app, simple, and your different options. So dear IT leader, if you're listening or watching, you have more choice in the cloud. So you don't have to go one-on-one copy paste or just migrate as it is. You have choices on complexity. What I also like what you mentioned, Josh, is that when you move to cloud, there is a baseline. So typically, dear IT leader, you have like 15 apps running locally. They're all a little bit different than snowflakes, but you move to cloud and then it has to be normalized or baseline. So it becomes more like a standard operating way. I like that as well. So great point. Now, you also mentioned in the book a very important part about network design.
Oh, yeah.
Now, public cloud is by default public. So from a leadership perspective, how important is network design and network topology in Azure?
It's huge. And there are two reasons why it's huge. One is from the security perspective, for making sure that everything is contained and secured in a fashion where external agents are not going to be able to infiltrate it and do something nasty or malicious with either your code, your data, or any of the above. The other thing to keep in mind with network design is the intent to use this in conjunction with your on-premises data centers, right? Because if you are, you're going to want a mechanism for connectivity. You want to make sure that that's secure, but you also want to make sure that it has the appropriate bandwidth on the circuit to handle the traffic that it's going to see. I've seen people implement ExpressRoute and would go with the cheapest option because they didn't want to spend the money, and then would complain that their DR or their business continuity, or even if they were running an active site, that, oh, hey, we're getting all kinds of latency with this stuff. Well, yeah, you picked a 1 gig pipe and you're expecting a 100 gig pipe. So there's a bit of a difference there that you do have to reconcile when it comes to throughput. The nice thing with a lot of modern cloud services now is a lot of them come with the ability to add a private endpoint or private connections, right? So that you can attach them all to a virtual network and have that all managed in that networking sphere, giving you better visibility into things, making sure that you can set alerts and quotas and things like that as well on traffic if you need to do any kind of throttling. So there's a lot of benefit to taking a good approach with designing that virtual network. Now, if you don't need that, I still recommend people use some sort of a construct with respect to virtual networking because, like you mentioned, the public cloud is public. If you leave it open and somebody decides to use a less than desirable password combination, as far as security is concerned, people can get brute force attacked with that stuff. So add your layers in and take it seriously and make sure that you've got a good reason for why you're designing the network the way that you are.
Hi there, I'm Jetro, your host, and I love bringing you fresh insights on cybersecurity, cloud technology, governance, and auditing. Cyber threats are evolving fast. Protecting your business, ensuring compliance, and maintaining trust with your stakeholders isn't just important, it is essential. Ignoring cybersecurity, that's a risk you don't want to take. No matter your industry or company size, protecting sensitive data and ensuring operational resilience should be a priority. Regulations like NIS2 and DORA are already shaping the way businesses handle security, making compliance non-negotiable. At SecWise, we help businesses like yours stay secure and compliant. Here's what we offer: security roadmaps, practical steps tailored to your operations, Azure, M365, or even your hybrid workplace. Compliance readiness. Meet ISO 27001, NIS2 and DORA requirements with confidence. SOC implementation, real-time threat detection and response 24/7. Cloud and AI security, advanced protection against evolving threats, and end-to-end support, from risk analysis to remediation and continuous access to our specialists. Since you're listening to the Blue Dragon podcast, as a thank you, you will get 3% off your next purchase within the SecWise portfolio. Whether it's a full NIS2 assessment or managed security services, 3% off your next purchase can save you hundreds of euros. Visit secwise.eu/Blue Dragon podcast to get started. Make cybersecurity your strength. Get started today. Visit secwise.eu/Blue Dragon podcast. You know, I love public cloud, but there's one downside that I think we need to be transparent with CTOs and IT leaders as well, which is typically if you're on premise, the network traffic cost, let's say, is either a fixed cost or it's like for free, right? You can download as much as you can from the on-premise environment, while within the cloud, every byte you send is free, but every byte you extract, you pay for. So how would you deal with that in your architecture?
Through a couple of different things. One is through FinOps, or financial operations. So looking at it from the perspective of what's your planned consumption, what's your planned egress, and doing capacity planning in that respect, right? So, how much of this data am I expecting to be going region to region for backup purposes, for disaster purposes, and also understanding when you're architecting your applications, and in a hybrid cloud is a very good example of this. How do you want that to be interacting? Maybe you may want to switch how you send the information for these jobs or for these programs to interact with. You may want to switch to, less frequent. You may want to switch to different timings on things. So like all that stuff comes into play in interesting ways. But you're right, the egress stuff will bite you if you're not careful. I have a really good example of this. Client that I used to work at, we set up a disaster recovery through Azure Site Recovery. We set up disaster recovery for a reporting suite. So this was a suite of machines that was running out of the box software. And the requirements for it were such that it had a huge amount of IOPS. I mean, it was all transactional, like really heavy duty processing and stuff like that to crunch down numbers for financial reporting. And the read and write ratios were so high that it basically freaked site recovery out. And was, instead of replicating the transactions, like your differentials on disk, it just started sending full copies because it couldn't keep up with the amount of differentials. And we didn't realize this was happening because we hadn't really run into a situation like that before. We didn't have a good reason to look for that up front. And the director called us a couple of weeks later and was trying to understand why he just got a $250,000 bill for egress.
Talk about bill shock.
Yeah. It was. I mean, we were able to get some things, blessed, if you will, from a billing perspective. But that was a hard lesson to learn, and not one that I will soon forget.
Definitely, and that actually ties neatly into FinOps, Cloud FinOps. If anybody takes a look on LinkedIn, you see this new role, the Cloud FinOps role, where it's like almost there's academy, there are certifications for the FinOps. It's becoming more and more important. Apart from the example you just gave, why is FinOps such an important aspect of cloud governance?
A couple of reasons. One is that people are still sometimes under the false assumption that going to the cloud is going to save you money. It will if you design it to save you money. Much the same as the security argument, right? All of the tools and everything else are there, but if you choose not to implement them, you're going to get a bill that you're not going to be happy with. A lot of it goes down to being able to properly account for and allocate costs per team, per department. That's not relevant for every organization, but a lot of enterprises look at that like, okay, how do we split this cost up and how do we determine who's using what share of the resources that we have? And it's also good just from a consumption standpoint to understand what it is that you're paying for, right? I mean, when I go to the mechanic, I don't want to give them a check for $1,200 and just have them go, okay, well, your car is cool. See you later. I want an itemized bill. Like I want to see what was done. I want to see why it cost what it cost. And fortunately, I've yet to encounter that in the real world, but it's the similar position, because you want to make sure that you're approaching things with conscientiousness in mind, and that has repercussions too, even into the sustainability area too. If you really think about that, the less that you're consuming, the less that you're adding to that footprint, the better off you're going to be. So I think there are a couple of different areas that really help.
Yeah, great. So, yeah, it's very important because moving to the cloud, typically an organization gets one invoice at the end of the month or the beginning of the next month. And then it's like, how do we spread this out internally across the different business lines? Cloud can help you do that by tagging and really by having transparency all the way down to the lowest resource if you've set up that environment. So that's why a Cloud FinOps person has that expertise. So that's really interesting indeed. And also bill shock, getting ahead of that. Definitely. Great. You also mention a lot in the book about the importance of automating and the abilities that you have compared to on-premise. So why is automating on cloud, and Azure specifically, why is that important and how does that help a business move forward?
Well, automating things gives you the ability to repeat things in a reliable way. We know that humans can usually repeat things, but it's not necessarily always the most reliable, especially in the instance of let's say an emergency situation or a high stress situation, right? People are going to cut corners to try and get things done. And then, we'll go back and fix that later. No, you won't. No, you won't. Just do it from the jump. Take some time, sit down, understand what your requirements are, understand what the best mechanism is for you to automate it. Everyone has opinions on what they think is the best. And it's really, find what works for you, find what works for your team, find out what works for your organization, and set some standards around that. And say, this is the mechanism we're using going forward. Make sure that all new deployments are using automation for, any kind of maintenance tasks or remediation tasks, things that typically, why they happen, they're going to happen. You don't want to tie up people specifically to go spend their time fixing that stuff because there are other more important things to do. Automate that as well. I learned that a long time ago.
Why, Josh? Because a business owner can say, they just, click in the portal of Azure and deploy stuff. Why do we need to write scripts and automate? They only deploy it once. Like in the old school, typical on-premise, we deploy it once and we configure it along the way.
Yeah, but you don't always just deploy it once, and that's the problem. There's always a situation where you're going to have to do it over, and it's probably going to be a significant amount of time after the first time you did it, so you're going to forget. So it's better to have something that says, hey, for this scenario, I can run this script, and it'll do everything that I need, and I don't have to worry about it, and I know that it'll be done the right way.
Exactly. I can give an anecdote for those business leaders who are listening. Like typically you have this three-staged environment. You have a development environment, some UAT testing, and then a production, some even a 4 or 5. Every time you want to simulate the production environment as good as you can. And I've been there in the past. I just came out of college. I went to my first programming job. I said, now it's running on my machine. How do we move it to a UAT environment? Yeah, you copy paste the files and you manually set up, the similar server, and then you move to cloud and somebody else does a copy paste and then tries to configure the production. There's always something off. There's always some feature missing or a configuration missing. So you want scripting and automation to have consistency throughout each staged environment. And that will help you deliver faster. That's my answer to those business leaders, because it takes some time to have your team learn how to script. If it's ARM or Bicep or Terraform, they need to get acquainted with it. So now IT ops people have to become small developers, let's say, or scripters, and that's an education investment. But from your perspective, Josh, do you think it's worth for a business to spend time and invest in these skills? Will it pay off in the long run, or is it just 1 or 2 use cases?
No, absolutely. I mean, this goes back to the IT operations problem statement of, oh, the cloud's coming, I'm going to become irrelevant. This is a prime example of making the investment in your people to learn new skill sets that are going to help them not only understand how things work better, but also be more valuable to their company professionally. And it allows them to have skills that are now portable, right? This helps build that career progression and allows you to then branch out into different areas, right? So you start with Terraform, but you might end up looking at, like you said, ARM or Bicep, or there's also Pulumi, right? You may end up branching into that. And it's like, oh, hey, I really like Pulumi. I want to start learning how to use Python, and so on and so on. So it definitely helps as an enabler to open doors for folks and really further that skill set.
Great. And recently, I learned of another use case of why it's important to do scripting and automations, and that was in the case of a cybersecurity attack. So I learned, this was also new for me because I'm in cybersecurity, I'm always learning new things, and in this case the organization was in Azure and got hacked, and it was ransomware, and they destroyed and they took down many servers. They deleted basically the configuration. So dear IT leader, if you do not have any scripting and automations, how will you deploy a new environment? And that organization was quite down for a long time because manually they had to restore. If you take that same organization, but that IT leader had scripts and automations in place, with a few clicks of the mouse, he could then basically rebuild the entire infrastructure on a different site. Of course, given that you have data backups, but the infrastructure was there. And it was exactly the same as the original one, if it was up to date. So I like that use case as well of automation.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
Yeah. All right, so then you also talk about data processing, OLTP systems in the cloud. I see from my clients that's one of the biggest drivers to move to cloud because of the virtually unlimited compute power and unlimited storage. So now we can move to cloud and do our data analytics because the local server is boiling and is heating up. Now we can move to Azure. What are some best practices on making decisions in Azure for OLTP processing, for example?
That's going to come down to understanding what your service options are and understanding what you need to provision to get a better result than what you're getting today, and following that FinOps guideline of let's be practical about what we're spending. Because you're right, you can go and you can spin up all kinds of compute to run analytics for you, but it's going to cost you, right? Like it's not just a matter of, oh, hey, I can spin all these things up and no one's the wiser. It's very much, you need to be mindful of what you're spending. Isolating and identifying what those workloads are is important. The idea behind using systems in Azure, services in Azure for OLTP processing, even things like Cosmos DB that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being an OLTP type of a service, has the capability to do high volume transactions and throughput, as well as have global replication. So it's a matter of, what's going to fit your use case? What do you want to get out of it? How do you want to push the envelope and kind of push things a little bit to get more performance and more results out of it? But also, what does that replication footprint look like for you? Do you need to have things globally available? Or is it okay to just have a locally redundant copy? It just depends on what you really want to get out of it. This also leads into an interesting conversation that a lot of folks tend to have their brains break from which is the notion of immediate versus eventual consistency, and event-driven programming and event-driven architectures, and understanding that in some cases it's okay if the data is not up to date as of the time of the transaction. Now, obviously, OLTP is going to expect you to have that that acidity, that immediacy with the transactions, because you need to make sure that stuff is being captured. But when you start to look at, well, maybe this process that's tied into OLTP isn't necessarily a candidate for it because it's only extracting information at certain times, or it's only being used to build a certain view of data. So you can actually take different components and different use cases out of your applications and say, well, you know what, it may make more sense to run that under something like Synapse, or using things like Fabric and Power BI to be able to visualize and extract that information in a way that's a bit more isolated, but gives you more power to slice and dice.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, with cloud also comes a whole ecosystem around it. So it's no longer just a SQL Server or a Cosmos DB. There's a whole ecosystem around it, from data intake and transformation, and then loading it into the desired state and the endpoints, let's say. Can you share a bit more, like what does the Azure ecosystem provide when it comes to data analytics and data processing?
A lot more than you probably think. So the obvious things like your Azure SQL, you have things like MySQL, MariaDB, Cassandra. So everything from time series databases all the way through transactional processing, Cosmos, again, for your NoSQL or your unstructured. There are also things like storage accounts at different tiers that will give you the ability to obviously store things, but you can also use them in the means of processing data, right? Like a lot of times people will write function apps that listen for something hitting a storage account. That storage account is going to act as the mechanism of action to kick off a function that pulls it. Maybe it writes another file back to it, or maybe it writes records to a database. You have things like SQL Managed Instance that allow you to have more of a, I'll say, pet-friendly, right? Like the VM look and feel, where you get to go in and touch it and this is my favorite SQL server. This is where I have all of my tools installed. So you do have the ability to do things like that, and you can also run into Synapse analytics, which is going to give you more of that real-time processing, stream processing. So if you've got a manufacturing line and you have checkpoints on that manufacturing line that are all sending information in real time, you can capture that using like a stream analytics job to look at what that trending looks like. Right? Is the line running appropriately, or are there areas where there are inefficiencies and maybe somebody needs to go to the floor and actually go take a look at that? Even things like event hubs, service bus, all that stuff is still working with data. It's just not necessarily in the database format that you may be, accustomed to.
Exactly. That's actually a pretty nice use case. And for those IT leaders wondering, like, what's it all about? A few years ago, I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago, Microsoft had a very nice, let's say, introductory workshop to IoT on Azure with the IoT Hub. And a colleague and I, we created with Arduinos, these little breadboards, and was a little sensor for a CO2 and a temperature sensor. And we connected it via Wi-Fi to Azure, and then connected even a Power BI dashboard to it. And so the nice thing was you could just like breathe into the sensor, you could see the CO2 spike, and it really went into the cloud, and like within 5 seconds you saw the live dashboard, reflecting the situation. So just to give you an understanding, IT leader, that data and analytics in the cloud is much more than just your traditional SQL Server. You can combine it with IoT, you can combine it with sensors, and then do big data analytics on top, all in one ecosystem. I really love that. That's powerful. Absolutely.
We could probably do a complete side session about Arduino, Raspberry Pi, and all that other stuff. Just have a nerd session on that, because that's one of my favorite areas. I still have a ton of different boards that I experiment with, mainly because I have a short attention span and I need something to keep me occupied. But nice. It's definitely something that I enjoy quite a bit. So
great. But talking about other, let's say, exotic services on Azure, let's talk about serverless, or functions as a service. What are they? Why are they important? And do you actually see them being used, or is it more like a hype?
Oh, no. I think so I'll address the hype part first. No, people do use them, and they use them in situations that allows for fanning out and scaling out in pretty dramatic fashion. The idea behind serverless is pretty simple. We have a managed piece of compute for you that you can use to execute a subset of code, whether that's a script, whether that's an actual program. There are many different things you can tie into it, but the idea is that it should be something small and self-contained. It shouldn't be, doing like long polling or, being involved in something that's going to require a lot of lengthy processing. Like it's meant for quick action. It's meant for doing things in a fast and efficient manner. I've seen folks using that for, like I mentioned before, processing files. So if you've got a storage account out there and people are uploading files to that, like let's say that they're uploading a batch transaction report for banking or something like that, a function could pick that up, parse it, separate it out by account type or account number, and then be able to then move those files into another area that's ready for processing for specific item processing, as an example. You can also do things with using them as API endpoints, which is kind of it's an interesting use case. It's an interesting perspective. It can get kind of crazy if you do like microservices, especially where you've got, thousands of microservices potentially within an application landscape. And each one of those is a function. Like that's kind of tough to manage, right? So, tread with caution, but it gives you the ability to, like I said, fan that out into a high capacity, and you have the ability to set that capacity through the plan that you pick to host the compute, and it's available for you whenever you need it.
Yeah. So it makes the life of a developer easier in the sense that they can just write their code, their small piece of code, and it takes care of everything else underneath it. What I also have seen that business leaders like about functions is when I say, dear leader, you have built this wonderful application you're providing as a SaaS solution, let's say. But how do you know for sure that little feature or that button is used often? Perhaps it's just used once in a year. Or how do you know which of these parts are fast and slow? Right? And then you ask the dev team, we have no idea which part is fast. And then with functions, you can actually see how often has it run, has it been executed. So now you get metrics on the usage of the software. And also you get the runtime. So how long does it take to compute this little piece of functionality? And then some developers say, I didn't know my search script took so long. I need to rework it. So it gives transparency in usage and speed. And I've seen that very efficiently. I like that about functions.
Yeah, I agree.
And then, of course, there's a danger, right? What if you, Josh, if you were the evil Josh on a Monday morning and you just write a for loop and you just execute the function a million times? What will my invoice look like? Like, what can we do to control that?
So for things like that, you typically will want to set up monitoring to look at execution. Normally, you're going to have a general idea of how often something should be executing, and if it goes beyond that, it can definitely be, cause for alarm, let's say. So there are ways to set up alerts for usage thresholds. You can set up throttling. You can do things like set up budgets even. So you can set a specific budget up, and that's part of like the FinOps conversation, but it's also part of the governance conversation. I only want this particular resource group to be able to spend $100 in the course of a month. Now, that's an arbitrarily low example, but you can trigger then remediation efforts if something hits that budget, right? So if you hit up, within 5 minutes of the month starting and you're already hitting that limit, you can then go and say, okay, shut it down, right? Back out whatever's there, and we'll investigate it in a lower environment, figure out what the problem is, and then resubmit that to make sure that it's good to go. So it's that proactivity that's going to help you, not get absolutely lambasted when it comes to the billing cycle.
Exactly, which then ties neatly into our earlier point about cloud operations or FinOps. Let's say, dear IT leader, if you place no guardrails, then you can get a bill shock because they can do functions around all the time because you pay per execution per millisecond. So, but if you place the guardrails, you're in control, right? And I think that's a great balance between letting your IT folks innovate and experiment while also keeping costs under control. But I still see, I don't know how it is in the US, but here in Belgium and Netherlands, I still see way too many organizations that are in Azure, but there's no governance around it. How is that in the US typically?
The same. Yeah,
Same.
it's interesting that, with as many years as we've had talking with folks, having, conferences, having, webinars and everything else to kind of get people used to the idea of looking at this from that perspective. People are still like, oh, hey, well, I inherited this thing that somebody wrote 7 years ago, and they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't understand Azure, and now I have to go back in and retrofit all of these governance controls around, what we're doing today. And I'd say that there's a very high degree of luck involved with a lot of these companies, because given some of the states that I've seen, they probably should have been hacked or had a breach within that time period, because it was entirely possible.
Exactly. Yeah.
So-
I've done in the last couple of months 6 cloud Azure security assessments, and then we're going through the MCSB, the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, and there's a whole, let's say, domain or a section on governance, and you see there are no policies in place. The application is in Azure and it's running and it's working fine, and now they're thinking, is it secure, right? And then we come in and it's like 3 out of 10 or a score of 30%. It's crazy how they're focused on operational efficiency and they completely disregard security and safety protocols. What would you give as advice to IT leaders thinking about moving to cloud or already being in cloud?
Have a policy of continuous review. Doesn't have to be daily or weekly or even monthly, but there should be a cycle in which you're looking at 3 things. Are we spending appropriately? Are we secure? Are our folks productive and satisfied with what they're using? Like, those should be the 3 key areas that you really look at. And the security thing, that should be a part of everything that you do. And I believe Donovan Brown, I think at one time, had said something to the effect of, it's not DevSecOps, it's DevOps, because security is already baked into every portion of that from a cultural and process perspective. So I always look at it like that should just be table stakes at this point. Security should be, that should be a concern regardless of what you're doing. And just taking the time to review what your governance strategy is, what your guardrails are, if there are any, policy updates or any kind of standards that are coming out that are revised that you need to worry about implementing controls for. Those are all things that you should be doing on a continuous basis.
Great. Yeah, I would add to that, just dear IT leader, if you are in Azure already or in the cloud and you've been working there and it's running, now is a great time to do a security assessment. Hire some specialist from outside. It's a few days of work. You get a nice assessment. You see the strengths and weaknesses, and then your IT ops team can work with those. Take that assessment. It's really worth the money, and it gives you also peace of mind and a roadmap that is actionable. Right. So go for it, definitely. Yeah. Josh, to wrap up, the book also ends with architecting secure applications on a trusted platform. So we talked a little bit about cybersecurity importance there. If we take a look at the future of Azure, it has evolved immensely in the last 3-4 years. Right? What is the future like for Azure from your perspective, technological wise, like for businesses to innovate, etc.?
You're gonna see more improved service offerings. You're going to see a wider variety of use cases being able to be adapted to specific services. And ultimately, it's going to, I think in some ways, disrupt and upend the way that people think about applications and development and hosting those applications, because especially with the rise of a lot of the different AI services that are out there, but also things like confidential computing and other very industry-specific things that you want to be able to leverage to give yourselves that competitive advantage. I think that's what we're really going to see kind of taking off, and whether that's using services, in unique ways to solve problems, or whether that's just the availability of having things like confidential compute or high GPU processing for vector processing for AI, things like that. I think you're going to see a lot more of that over the next few years.
Great. So very, let's say, industry specific or use case specific applications there. Got it. Because the core is already there. You can deploy VMs, containers, functions. So they're moving up the stack with niche use cases. Nice. By the way, when I give the AZ900 training, the Azure fundamentals, and there's a chapter on Azure architecture, I show them the globe, right? The 3D globe, and then you see Azure, all the zones and regions and geographies. And then on the website, you can see the satellites. And I say, look, there's Azure Orbital. Even ships can have communication through satellites. To Azure. Like, wow, we didn't know about that. So I like those exotic use cases. So great point there, but I'll do that. Wonderful. Last question, Josh. What is in your future? Another book? What's your future looking like?
Ooh, that is an awfully good question. I'm going to take a hiatus a little bit from, I think, the book writing spheres that can tend to be rather time intensive. I would love to get into doing some more videos / blogging about stuff that I'm not necessarily as comfortable with. So, big data, doing some of the like multi-agentic workflows using, the agents UI and AutoGen and stuff like that. Just really exploring and seeing what else I can do. I'm always tinkering on home automation stuff. So maybe there'll be an interesting post about, activating sirens when animals enter your yard due to cameras that are watching, just goofy stuff like that. Nothing too terribly exciting, but yeah, nice. That's probably about it.
Nice, wonderful. Yeah, if you mentioned that it's a lot of work to write a book. Imagine the work to review a book, because I was a technical reviewer of the book of yours, and I remember the manuscripts and going through the testing everything. But it's a great piece of work. So, dear IT leader, if you're interested in wanting to know what is Azure, how can it help my business, how can I integrate it into my business, not in a deep technical way, but understanding the principles and the benefits, the book Azure Integration for Business by Pact and by Josh is a great read. I highly recommend it. We'll also put the link in the description for those who want it. Josh, thank you so much for joining this episode. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. I wish you all the best, and perhaps see you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you much. I appreciate being here.
So thank you for viewing this episode of the Blue Dragon podcast. I really hope that you learned new things from Josh. I did, and I loved listening to him. The book is also amazing, so go pick up a copy of the book. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, and also go to bluedragonpodcast.com, leave your email address, and you'll get a notification of each episode with an executive summary of all the topics that we discussed during this episode. Have a wonderful day, and see you next time.